Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at something that's really important for any organization that wants to be successful, and that is the managerial function of directing. And believe it or not, our source for this is going to be a 12th grade business studies textbook chapter. I know what you're thinking. Textbook deep dive. Sounds super exciting, right? Word. But trust me on this one. It's got some really interesting insights into motivation and leadership. So think about it this way. What is it that makes some companies so successful, while others, they just kind of struggle to get by? Well, we're going to find out by unpacking the key elements of directing.
It really is an interesting question when you think about it. We tend to think of directing as just telling people what to do, but it's a lot more than that. Directing is really more about guiding and inspiring and leading people towards a shared goal. It's about making a work environment where people actually feel motivated,
Yeah.
and empowered to do their best work.
So it's less about like barking orders and more about setting the stage for everyone to do well.
Exactly. The textbook actually defines directing as a continuous process of instructing, guiding, and motivating people. And it doesn't just apply to, the top level managers. It's relevant to management at every level.
That makes sense. I mean, everybody's kind of guiding or mentoring somebody else in some way. I mean,
Yeah.
the textbook actually uses companies like Big Foes, Infosys, and Tata, and BHEL to show this. Like, even when managers change that directing function, it has to remain constant because it's really essential for any organization to work properly.
Yeah, you can think of directing kind of like the conductor of an orchestra.
Mhm.
Brings everybody together and makes sure they're in sync and helps the company as a whole, create something beautiful.
Yep.
The textbook actually lists out several benefits of directing. Like it initiates action, aligns individual efforts with organizational goals,
Yeah.
and it helps foster cooperation and bring stability and balance to a company. But one of the things I found most interesting was the example of Rashmi Joshi.
Oh, yeah, Rashmi, the sales manager. She was so ambitious and then she hit a slump after she got passed over for promotion. It's a great example of how authority on its own just isn't enough. Even if you're in a management position, you really have to understand your team and what motivates them.
Yeah, it really shows that directing goes beyond just, wielding power. It's about understanding the people you work with, like what drives them, what inspires them, what makes them feel valued and like they're part of something.
The human element, basically. And the textbook actually goes into that by describing the whole motivation process. And it all starts with an unmet need. Like you have this unmet need and it creates this tension, this drive,
Yeah.
to try to satisfy it. And once you fulfill that need, then the tension goes away. I thought it was pretty interesting how they talked about Tata Steel and how their motivational programs were so successful. They focused on things like employee participation and career advancement opportunities. And what's cool is that, Tata Steel, they understood what their employees needed.
Yeah.
And they actually created programs that benefited every.
Yeah, absolutely. It really shows how when a company really takes the time to understand its employees and they try to meet their needs, everybody wins. And, speaking of needs, we can't talk about motivation without bringing up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, it's like motivation 101.
Right. Maslow's theory, it's like the foundation of understanding what motivates people. He had this idea, with the 5 levels of needs, starting with physiological needs like, food and shelter, then safety and security, and then belongingness and love, and then esteem, and then finally self-actualization.
Right. And each of those needs builds on the one before it. And once a need is met, it no longer motivates you. So, if someone's struggling to pay rent, offering them a fancy job title probably isn't going to mean much to them.
Like trying to feed somebody who's starving a gourmet meal. You got to take care of the basics first.
Right. And that actually leads us to the types of incentives that managers can use, to motivate their teams. The textbook breaks it down into financial and non-financial incentives.
So financial incentives are the obvious ones, right? Like salary and bonuses. But the textbook points out that money isn't everything, which I think we all know from experience.
It's true. Sometimes those non-financial incentives are actually more powerful. The textbook talks about the impact of just, praise and recognition, like just a simple thank you or a shout out during a meeting. It can really boost someone's morale.
It makes you feel appreciated, right?
Exactly. And then there's job enrichment, which is basically designing jobs to be more challenging and more meaningful. So you're tapping into that intrinsic motivation, that drive that comes from within, not from some external reward. Remember Tata Steel, they've been really successful by giving their employees more autonomy and letting them make more decisions.
And it seems like that sense of ownership can be really motivating. But let's switch gears for a second. What about leadership? I mean, what's the role of leadership in all of this? It seems like it's that extra something that separates good companies from the really great ones.
You're absolutely right. The textbook even talks about really influential leaders, like Bill Gates and the Ambanas, but it emphasizes that leadership is about more than just managing tasks. It's about inspiring people and influencing them to work towards a shared vision.
It's about setting the tone and leading by example
Uh,
and, getting everybody on board with a common purpose. And then there are different styles of leadership too, right? The textbook mentions autocratic and democratic and laissez-faire styles. It seems like they all have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. The best leadership style often depends on the situation,
Yeah.
the people involved,
Mm-hmm.
and the company culture. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. It seems like even with all the right motivation
Hmm.
and, inspiring leadership, things can still go wrong if the communication breaks down. The textbook's really clear about how essential communication is.
It's so true. I mean, it makes you wonder, how can we be sure that our message isn't just heard but actually understood? The textbook goes into the communication process.
Mhm.
And it breaks it down into steps. The
Mhm.
sender encodes the message and chooses a channel. The receiver decodes it and then gives feedback. It sounds pretty straightforward,
Mm.
but there are so many things that can go wrong along the way.
Yeah, it really is. It's like that game of telephone we used to play as kids, where the message starts out one way, and by the time it gets to the last person, it's completely different.
And in the workplace, I mean, those communication breakdowns can lead to all sorts of problems. Missed deadlines, projects getting messed up, people getting frustrated. But before we get into all the ways communication can go wrong, I'm curious about the different types of communication. The textbook mentions formal and informal communication. What's the difference? That's a good question. So formal communication is the kind that follows the official channels. Like whatever's outlined in the company structure. So think memos, emails, official reports, those regularly scheduled meetings. It's usually documented, and it follows a clear path.
So it's the stuff that's on the record, basically.
Exactly. And formal communication can actually be divided even further into vertical and horizontal communication. So vertical communication flows up and down the hierarchy, like a manager giving instructions to their team, or an employee sending a report to their supervisor.
Okay, that makes sense. So then horizontal communication would be between people at the same level, like different departments working together on a project.
Exactly. The textbook also talks about communication networks within formal organizations. It's like you're mapping out all the different ways information can travel.
Oh, so like the different routes information takes depending on how the company's structured?
Exactly. There are a few different types, like the single chain, the wheel circular free flow, and the inverted V. And they each have their own structure and implications for how information gets shared and received.
Can you give me an example? I'm having trouble picturing how these networks actually work.
Sure. So imagine a really traditional hierarchy where communication only flows from the top down through each level of management. That would be a single chain network. And then there's the wheel network where all communication flows through one central person. It's kind of like a hub and spoke model.
Ah, okay. So with the wheel network, there's one person in the middle, and they're responsible for passing information to everyone else.
Exactly. Each network has its pros and cons, and some are better suited for certain types of information, like the free flow network, where everyone can communicate with each other directly. That's great for brainstorming and getting creative, but it might not be the best way to share confidential information.
Yeah, that makes sense. You wouldn't want sensitive information just floating around. But let's move on to the more interesting stuff. Informal communication. The textbook calls it the grapevine. What exactly does that mean? I imagine it's all those conversations that happen outside of official channels.
You got it. Informal communication is all those water cooler chats, the quick conversations in the hallway, those little side comments during meetings. It's not documented, and it spreads organically, kind of like vines growing in every direction.
So it could be a good thing or a bad thing. On the one hand, information can spread quickly, but on the other hand, rumors and gossip can spread like wildfire.
Exactly. The grapevine can be a really valuable tool for building relationships and getting a feel for what's going on in the company. But
Mhm.
because it's not regulated or documented, things can easily get taken out of context or distorted.
The textbook actually breaks down different types of grapevine networks, too,
Hmm.
like single strand, gossip probability, and cluster networks. It's like a whole science.
It is. Each network represents a different pattern of information flow. So in a single strand network, information is passed from one person to another in a line. And then in a gossip network, one person shares information with multiple people. And then those people share it with others. And so on.
It's fascinating how these informal networks can have such a big impact. Even though they're not officially recognized, it shows how interconnected we all are.
It really highlights the human element of communication. We're social creatures. And we need connection and information. These informal networks help us meet those needs. But, with all this talk about communication, both formal and informal, it seems like there are so many ways for things to go wrong.
Yeah, it feels like communication is this minefield. You never know when you're going to step on something.
Well, the textbook does go into those communication barriers in detail. It divides them into 4 main groups: semantic barriers, psychological barriers,
Wow.
organizational barriers, and personal barriers.
Okay, let's break that down. What are semantic barriers?
So semantic barriers have to do with the meaning of words and how people interpret them, like using jargon with someone who doesn't understand it, or a message getting lost in translation. It can easily lead to misunderstandings. The textbook also talks about unclarified assumptions. What's obvious to one person might not be obvious to another.
I've totally been there. You think you're being perfectly clear, and then you realize the other person completely missed the point.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
And then you have psychological barriers,
Yeah.
which are all about our emotions and perceptions. Like, imagine trying to have a productive conversation when you're stressed out. You're probably not going to be a very good listener. Or if you already have a negative opinion of the person you're talking to, you might misinterpret what they're saying.
It's like we all have these filters that affect how we see things.
Exactly. And the textbook points out how things like lack of attention, or jumping to conclusions, or a lack of trust could really get in the way of communicating effectively.
And then there are organizational barriers. Those are related to the company's structure and culture, right?
Right. So think about a company with a really rigid hierarchy, where information has to go through multiple levels of approval, or a culture where people are afraid to speak up or disagree with their boss.
That would definitely stifle creativity.
Absolutely. And then lastly, you have personal barriers.
Yeah.
These are things that are specific to each individual.
Like being afraid to speak up, or lacking confidence, or just not feeling like communicating.
Right. It's amazing how our personalities and experiences can shape the way we communicate and create opportunities and challenges in the workplace.
So with all these barriers, it's kind of a miracle that we ever communicate effectively. What can we do to increase our chances of getting our message across?
Yeah. That's where the textbook offers some really helpful advice on how to overcome these barriers and become better communicators.
Okay, so what's the secret? How do we avoid these communication disasters?
Well, first of all, the textbook emphasizes the importance of clarifying your ideas before you even start communicating. Take some time to think about what you want to say, why it's important, and how you can say it clearly.
It's like that saying, measure twice, cut once.
Exactly. And secondly, be mindful of who you're talking to. Tailor your message to their needs and understanding. If you're talking to someone who's not familiar with technical terms, don't use them.
It's all about putting yourself in their shoes.
Right. And don't underestimate the power of language and tone, especially when you're writing, because things can be so easily misinterpreted. Sometimes a well-placed emoji can make all the difference.
Oh, I've learned that the hard way. But one thing I found really helpful is encouraging feedback. When you create a space where people feel comfortable asking questions and voicing their concerns, you can catch a lot of misunderstandings before they become big problems.
That's a really important point. Communication has to be a two-way street. It's not just about talking, it's also about listening and making sure everyone's on the same page. And don't forget to follow up, make sure your message was received and understood, and address any questions that come up.
Close the loop.
Exactly. Effective communication takes effort and intentionality, and a willingness to adjust based on the situation. It's an ongoing process of building understanding and trust.
So we've talked about different types of communication, the potential problems, and some strategies for being successful. But it feels like there's still more to unpack when it comes to directing.
You're right. We've only just scratched the surface of this really important management function.
Welcome back, everyone. So we've talked a lot about directing, motivation and leadership styles, and that whole complex world of communication. But there's one more important piece of the puzzle, and that's supervision. That day-to-day guidance that keeps everything running smoothly. The textbook really highlights supervision as a key part of the directing function.
Yeah, it's often overlooked. But supervision is what ties everything together. It's that link between setting goals and actually achieving them. The textbook actually looks at supervision in two ways.
Oh, that's interesting. What are the two perspectives?
So first, it sees supervision as like an element of directing, meaning every manager, no matter what level they're at, supervises someone. But then it also looks at supervision as a separate function, performed by supervisors. Those managers who are directly working with the employees doing the tasks? They're the ones on the front lines making sure things get done.
So they're the bridge between the big picture strategy and the day-to-day work.
Exactly. And the textbook really emphasizes how important supervisors are by listing all the different roles they play.
So what is it that makes a supervisor so important?
Well, for one thing, they're in constant contact with the employees. They're not just giving orders, they're building relationships and mentoring and creating a positive work environment.
It's about teamwork, not just hierarchy.
Right. They're also the link between the employees and upper management. They have to communicate information both ways and make sure everyone's on the same page and that any issues or feedback are addressed.
They're like interpreters, making sure everything runs smoothly.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's also the whole aspect of keeping the team unified. Supervisors often have to resolve conflicts and encourage teamwork and foster a sense of belonging among the workers.
They build a cohesive unit.
Right. And of course, they're also responsible for making sure the work actually gets done. Setting targets, tracking progress, providing guidance, keeping everything on schedule.
It's a balancing act between accountability and support.
It is. Good supervisors are also good trainers. They help their team members learn and grow, which benefits everyone. And finally, effective supervisors are leaders. They inspire their team and motivate them to do their best. And they create that positive and productive work environment we talked about.
Wow, they really do wear a lot of hats.
They do. As you can see, supervision is much more than just telling people what to do. It takes a special set of skills.
It's about understanding people
Yeah.
and their strengths and weaknesses and creating an environment where they can thrive.
Exactly. And when it's done well, supervision can be a really powerful thing. It can help individuals and the organization succeed. So we've come to the end of our deep dive into directing. And we've seen how it involves motivation, leadership, communication, and supervision.
It's all about people, understanding what they need and making them feel valued so they can achieve their goals.
And even though we've been focusing on a textbook about directing in a formal setting, these principles can be applied to so many other parts of our lives.
You mean like outside of work?
Absolutely. Think about leading a volunteer group, or even managing family dynamics. These ideas of directing and motivating people, and communicating clearly and being supportive, they're valuable in any situation where you're working with others.
It's like a life skill.
It is. Well, it's been great exploring all this with you.
Thanks for taking us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. And remember, the best leaders are always learning and growing, so keep thinking about these principles and how you can apply them in your own life.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and interesting. Until next time.